Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Graham Linehan. He's an Irish television comedy writer and director who, often in partnership with Arthur Mathews, has written or co-written a string of successful television comedies. He's best known for creating or co-creating the sitcoms Father Ted, Black Books, The IT Crowd, and Motherland. And I've said this before, but The IT Crowd is along with Monty Python's Flying Circus, the two funniest series I've ever seen.
That's really kind of you. Thank you. Thank you, Derrick. I really appreciate that.
Okay, so let's go from comedy to tragedy.
Yeah.
And today you have done some really good work on the subject of grooming. Can you talk about what is grooming and what are we talking about?
God, well, I mean, someone who's worked so much with child abuse, survivors and advocacy as you have, I don't think really there's anything I can tell you that's new. But the thing is, I think there's a deliberate misunderstanding of the word. And well, sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's not so deliberate. Grooming is often associated with pedophilia, and sure, pedophiles groom. That's what they do. I don't know. I often mention it, but the Netflix series Abducted in Plain Sight was about a groomer who saw a family that were unhappy. The father was gay, the mother was lonely, and he used the fault lines in that relationship to get close to the child in the family. But he didn't just groom the mother and father and the child, he groomed the surrounding area, people he worked with, people at his work. He was a neighbor, and his whole life was just spent planning this extraordinary, moment of abuse. Like he took the girl away for a few days. Again, the parents were so successfully groomed that they thought nothing of it, even though, and I'm spoilers here, so if you haven't watched it, you might want to skip forward about 30 seconds. Even though the groomer had started a relationship with the father and the mother. So it's an extraordinary film. And, the grooming continued right up until the last moment. Again, you don't want to see this if you haven't seen the thing itself, but where he convinced the girl that they'd been kidnapped by aliens. I'm not making this up. And they had to have sex to continue the human race. Just an extraordinary story. I mean, your jaw is on the floor for most of it. But it reminded me when I watched it of something a social worker once said, who was a real kind of expert in grooming, in spotting it and recognizing it. And she said that an organization that has been groomed will defend the groomer right up until the moment the handcuffs go on. Or they will even defend the groomer right up until the moment he's pronounced guilty and sent to prison, or even after that. Because groomers groom. They are expert manipulators. They are geniuses in a kind of evil sense. That's talking about the kind of sociopathic ones, the paedophilic ones, the ones who want to get close to children. But I think there's another form of grooming, which is ideological grooming. And I think that's happening at a society-wide level at the moment. I think if you look at, for instance, today, we were just talking about it earlier, the cover of Time magazine features Ellen Page, who now identifies as a boy and has had a double mastectomy. Her lesbian wife has left her, and she's taken off her healthy breast, And Time magazine presents this as if it's a fantastic moment of empowerment. That's grooming, They're grooming us to look at a young woman who's suffering from internalized misogyny, and whatever other, possible mental problems Ellen has. And they're turning it into the reverse of what it is. They're turning it into a story of liberation, when in fact it's a terribly sad story of someone who's so trapped by gender roles that they felt they had to cut off their part of their body to quote unquote fit. You know, it's terribly sad, and it's the fact that most people look at that cover and think it's wonderful and think it's something to be celebrated. It means that they have been successfully groomed, I think.
So recently in the United States, Senator Rand Paul was part of a hearing as to whether or not to confirm male from Pennsylvania as an assistant secretary of health. And one of the questions and the male identifies as transgender. And one of the questions that Rand Paul asked was, do you think that children are mature enough to be able to make the decision to cut off their genitals? I'm paraphrasing here, and to take wrong sex hormones. And the person up for the position really refused to answer twice. And the response by sort of the mainstream media was to call Rand Paul names, and then the other part of the response was to say that this is irrelevant because it never happens with children, that children are not, that this is not a thing really. And
sure.
Can you talk about so I just saw something a couple days ago also where a mother was disappointed that her, I believe it was 4 or 5-year-old, no longer wanted to be trans. Do you remember that?
There's so many stories like that, though. So
the point is that it is true. I mean, and the people who are pushing this ideology will argue that they know from when, I mean, if a baby likes pink rather than blue, or if it likes, certain things, that lets us know. So can you just talk about, children and the trans ideology just in general for a moment?
Well, a few things are being, it's just a funny thing. The word trans is like a magic word for some of these people. I'll give you an example. Patton Oswalt today tweeted favorably a video of a conservative Christian talking about his trans daughter. And it turns out that his trans daughter is actually a young boy who was gender non-conforming. And this conservative Christian didn't like it, as conservative Christians tend to not like things like that. But instead of saying, well, this is obviously terrible, and he should have just let his child his young son wear dresses. What's the problem with that? The word trans turns him into a kind of something else, and everybody suddenly gets hypnotized. And this clear example of homophobia is transformed into something, again, like the Ellen Page cover. It's transformed into the reverse of what it is. So you have the strangest thing of Patton Oswalt, a comedian, a liberal comedian, favorably talking about this man who was uncomfortable with their gender non-conforming child. So uncomfortable that he's not forcing, but I would say he's encouraging, let's say, his son to dress as a girl. And you may call this grooming, but I think it's a slightly different thing because it's not done from the outside. But what I think is happening there is just a terrible, terrible thing of a child wanting to please their parents. And the child knows that playing with girls' toys, wearing girls' clothes is not pleasing the parents. But the word trans seems to make everything go away. The word trans seems to make everything okay. And they can be a happy family. It's the most aggressive thing I've ever heard of. And the thing that always blows me away about this ideology is that all the evidence, all the scandals of this ideology, they're all out there already. Like, for instance, if you look at Susie Green's TED Talk, Susie Green is the CEO of Mermaids. who, the moment her son hit 16, she took him to Thailand and had him, got him a sex change operation. She'd been feeding him hormones, and puberty blockers since he was like a toddler or just older than a toddler. And she admits in this TED talk in front of a bunch, I always point this out because there's a great story about apparently con men used to love New York because they said New Yorkers were the best people to fool because they thought they were smarter than everyone else. And similarly, you have this TED talk audience. And again, they're listening to a story of a homophobic father who was unhappy about their son playing with girls' toys and wearing girls' clothes. And they called him trans, gave him lots of drugs, and then he was castrated on his 16th birthday. And again, this is a story of just wonderful liberation and freedom, and not to parents who, again, could have just let their kid play with girls' toys and wear girls' clothes. Someone said, there was someone on a TV show or an interview or something, but it was a parent. And they said when their young daughter transitioned, they said, she had a double mastectomy. I said, the first thing we did was got her football boots out of the attic or whatever. Like she couldn't wear football boots. She couldn't play football if she was a girl. It's these ideas. They're so regressive and so backwards. And we've been groomed into thinking that they are just the absolute spear point of progressivism, and it's anything but.
So you have written, we have been groomed to accept straight white men on lesbian dating apps. We have been groomed to accept straight white men in women's sports. We've been groomed to accept straight white men in women's prisons. We've been groomed to accept straight white men in women's hospital wards. And finally, most disgracefully, in rape crisis centers. So when you talk about grooming, you're not just talking about children. You're talking about society as a whole, right?
Yes. I guess you could say another word is conditioning, brainwashing. But I think grooming is the le mot juste here because children are involved. And when children are involved, for instance, when safeguarding measures are weakened or blurred or made unworkable, then groomers, and I mean groomers in the old-fashioned sense, are the ones who will benefit. So I use the word in many different ways, but I think grooming, I think it's an important word because I think that it's the closest thing to describing what's happening to society at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to take it away from transgender ideology for a second, and I'm really curious about this. What's the difference? Okay, so is having children say the Pledge of Allegiance, is that grooming them into being patriotic? Is this, or when I was a kid, I was a Christian, and songs are incredibly important ways for us to learn things, and we sang hymns when we were children. And then more recently, I know that this is a terrible thing to say on some levels, but so I love Lewis Mumford's work. And when I first read Lewis Mumford, one of the things he did is he kind of attacked some rock and roll. And when I first read it in my 20s, I got very offended. But then a couple of years ago, I was watching a video of AC/DC playing a live show in Rio del Plata, and you have 100,000 people singing together, "I'm on the highway to hell." And all of a sudden, and I like that song, don't get me wrong, and I've seen AC/DC in concert, but that still kind of freaked me out that you have 100,000 people singing "I'm on the highway to hell" and waving around these little lighted demon heads. And so my point is grooming a subset of this, or is grooming just, is that just another way to say socialization? Cause don't you have to also sort of groom kids to be decent human beings as well? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do. And I'd say that the difference is they are trying to get kids to believe and to go for things that are counterintuitive. Like, for instance, to have a man walk into a room let's take the example of what's his name? Oh, Michael and Burns did a thing about him. Alex Drummond, who has a full beard, wears a dress, makeup, all that stuff. You know, he to me, he seems like a harmless enough eccentric, except for the fact that he's in Stonewall and going into schools and whatnot, telling children that, actually, I'm not sure he's doing this anymore, but he did it at one point, apparently. Going into schools and telling children, I'm a woman. To me, that's grooming, because it is trying to get, it is kind of forcing children to disbelieve the evidence in front of their eyes and so on. Like the girl at the end of the documentary I was talking about, who was told this fantastical story simply to get her into a position where she would acquiesce to this man without, you know, struggling or whatever you have to be. It's a dreadful story. But it's that kind of fantastical belief system that's being imposed on kids. And I do think it's imposed. I don't think the kids would come up with it themselves. I think kids say things like, I'm a girl, or they want to, you know, I'm a princess, if they're a boy, whatever it happens to be. You just don't stand in the way of that. You let that happen. You know, you let kids explore all that stuff. You don't tell them, oh, well, you know, this man I know over here, he's actually a girl. You know, then you're getting into an area where you're, you know, I mean, it maybe grooming is the wrong word at times, but you're lying. You're lying to a kid child. Surely that must be one of the worst crimes there are, you know? Like when you're lying to a child about Santa, you're doing so to create for that child a period of their life where they are fully convinced that magic exists, right? That's a great thing to do for a child. It's a great thing to do for anybody. I'm so happy I had that as a child, you know? Actually, I'll tell you a funny story about that. One year, Santa came and my son came up to me after he got the gifts and he said, I just don't know why you didn't get me anything. And I was like, and we'd just gotten this amazing gift and we were like, oh, well, yeah, I forgot. You know, I couldn't believe it. My heart broke. But, you know, you have a thing like that. That's a kind of nice example of what you can do for children, to take that trusting innocence that's central to their nature and turn it into something beautiful. And then there's this, you know, where they're telling kids that some men are women, some women are men. You can be born in the wrong body. There's such a thing as a male lesbian. There's such a thing as a male penis. I mean, you know, if you want to know what it looks like in terms of, I mean, the BBC, they have a channel for toddlers. It's basically turn it on. You can leave the room safe that your kid is not going to see ads or is going to see anything upsetting or anything at all realistic. So many of the shows are almost formless, like Teletubbies or In the Night Garden. They are surreal. They're calming, you know. And on this channel, they had an interview with a heterosexual couple, but the bloke identifies as a lesbian. So they say to this audience of toddlers, this is a lesbian couple. And that to me is when it becomes grooming. That's really, really dodgy. So, you know.
So how does, you know, I was in junior high. I was in elementary, junior, and high school in the 70s. And that was a point at which, there were big struggles for homosexuals to be allowed to teach. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mom's attitude during that time was, I don't care whether my son's teachers are gay or straight or lesbian or whatever, but what I don't want happening is I don't want my 10-year-old child's teachers talking about their sex life in any case. I mean, I don't.
Yeah. Why? What? Kids are disgusted at the whole idea of sex until they until they reach puberty. Before that, they can't look at kissing on TV. They don't want to know. They don't, and neither should they.
I have to tell you this story. I'm sure as a parent you've known this. I'm not a parent, but a friend of mine told me this, that when she told her 2 children about where babies come from, the older one, or the younger one, said, she described the process, and then the younger one said, "Does that mean that you and Dad did that?" And then the older one said, "Twice."
That's great. That's great. What a story. Yeah. It's wonderful. That's it. That's all they need to know. Do you know what I mean? Beyond that, it's stuff they'll grow into. And when the if a certain let's say alternative lifestyle appeals to them, they'll drift over to that. What's really frightening is the imposing of these things on children by adults. Imposing of these ideas.
Well, I really brought this part up because something that has made me very, very angry is I have seen videos of drag queens twerking in libraries for children. And the point isn't that they're drag queens. The point is that nobody should be twerking in front of children. And I don't understand how. We could have a little discussion of the whole queer theory pedophilia thing if you wanted, but I just find it horrifying that in general, that explicit sexual material is being presented to children.
Yeah, it's like people are. There's a kind of a. I take it. The way I see it is it's somewhat similar to the problem that Pride has at the moment. The Pride March suffers from schizophrenia. On the one hand, it's supposed to be a celebration of gay male sex, right? That's what it started as. Lesbian sex too, but it was very much dominated in the early years, I think, by gay men who were coming out and much more open and less ashamed of who they were, which was all great. So that's what Pride was, and there's a lot of overt sexuality at Pride as a result. But then it became something else when it had been corporatized. And when all these kind of businesses got in touch and so on, and it ends up on rainbow lanyards and rainbow Starbucks cups and whatever it happens to be. And the thing about the rainbow is it is as appealing to children as it is to gay people. So suddenly people are bringing their kids to Pride and they don't really belong at Pride. So it's not a celebration of adult sexuality anymore. And it's not a day out for children. It's something in between. And that's why you see these photographs, that are so appalling of children, with these men who are dressed as dogs, who are doing this kind of BDSM play. And these children are holding their chains and stuff. And it's like, no, these two things don't go together. They shouldn't go together. They don't have to go together. And it's just, as I say, I think it's a form of schizophrenia that's come about with this idea, this kind of similar to the way that feminism, liberal feminism now means a kind of mushy generalized activism for everybody. In a similar way, Pride and the LGBT movement, because it's taken on so many letters after LGB, is basically a straight. It's not just gay people; it's straight people. Straight people who call themselves one of the letters after B. So again, it's just all. It's you mentioned queer theory, and it does seem to me to be all about boundaries disappearing between certain things. And I'm a very rigorous writer. I try and make sure that my structures are very, very tight, and I don't often succeed, especially when I'm doing it on my own. It's a hard job to create these, to create a scene or an episode that's about this one thing and keeps that very much in focus all throughout it. And doesn't let the audience get bored through the use of subplots and so on, but the subplots must have something to do with the main plot and so on and so forth. It's all very ordered and very, and the borders are very clear. You know what I mean? If a joke doesn't feel right for this episode, it's out. Because I know that if it doesn't fit in the episode, it will make it feel woolly and woody, or woolly and muddy and kind of amorphous. It won't feel like a story. And it's similar with all these kind of the boundaries that are breaking in between all these different events. They're making them less of what they should be, and they're turning them into something else that pleases nobody. You know, the drag queen story time is a brilliant example of that. You know, kids don't like it. I guarantee you, the kids only like it because they're just being reassured for the 1,000th time this person isn't going to kill them. Because the makeup is so bizarre and extreme. It's not like a pantomime. It's even more frightening. It's even more, grotesque, you know? So the kids have been reassured enough and it goes ahead and you know, photos happen and it looks like a kind of event for kids, but it's not. It doesn't please kids. It doesn't please adults. The only people it pleases are those people who've been groomed to think that this is all terribly marvelous and is ushering in a wonderful new world of acceptance, for gay people. But it's not. I think it's gonna, you know, you and I know, I think you may know this, Derek, but for the first time in something like 30 years in America, LGBT acceptance went down amongst young people in the last few years. Now that's extraordinary, you know, because it has been going steadily up for years. And suddenly, as soon as the T and every other letter after that comes along, it plummets, you know?
I think that is to be completely expected given, I mean, and at the same time, the honest to goodness acceptance of say gay relationships is really high. I mean, I know staunch conservatives. I was talking to, do you know the Tea Party? Does that mean anything in the UK? Tea Party.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I know a Tea Party member, and the phrase, my gay Asian friend, came out of his lips. I mean, that's just, you know, he has one of his best friends is gay. And, that sort of acceptance is one might not have seen 40 years ago. So that sort of acceptance is on the rise, but at the same time, I mean, even forgetting the children holding the leashes, I think the queer theory push for anything that has an orgasm at the end is acceptable, and you can't kink shame. I mean, so here's the core of queer theory, in my understanding, is that because homophobia is bad, therefore all strictures against all forms of sexuality are bad, and that includes causing pain. That includes pedophilia. It includes people dressing up as dogs. It includes everything. And I think that a lot of sane people wish that I know a lot of gays and lesbians who wish that those were not connected. That's all.
Yeah. It's cutting out a bit on my side, Derek, so I don't know if you might have to re-record that bit for yourself. But what was the last thing about lesbians?
Oh, just that a lot of gays and lesbians are horrified by the fact that they're now lumped in with people, with sadists, and with
yeah, I can imagine. And these three guys I saw in one photograph who were all dressed as little girls. You know, why are you dressed as little girls? That's not right. Do you know what I mean? I don't care. I really want to bring back king shaming in a big way. You know, my thing is, as long as you don't frighten the horses, you know, as long as you're not doing it on the street, frighten the horses, then fine, do whatever you would like. But, you know, it's not something for pride. You know, it's going to undo a lot of good work that's been done by gay civil rights activists.
Well, that's my point, is that with the numbers of acceptance going down, it's not because of gays and lesbians and bisexual people.
No,
anyway,
that's one thing they could be reassured by. You know what I mean? It's nothing to do with them. It's to do with the bloke with black eyeshadow who calls himself they and non-binary, and it's just a heterosexual dude. Do you know what I mean? That's who people don't like.
Okay, so before we started recording, you mentioned that there are some things going on with Amy Chunder, and
yes,
that ties into the whole. Can you give a little background with his father, his partner, and now him being a paid Redditor moderator, and whatever else is going on? Because
Amy Chunder's story,
this crazy grooming stuff.
Well, I think Amy Chunder's story will one day be seen as the story of these years, along with a few other famous names. But I think Amy's story is so perfect, because one of the things you get accused of when you're talking about this stuff, you know, because one of our big fears is self-ID and what that means for women's spaces. That's one of our big worries. But one thing you get accused of is and this is just a thing they use to shut you down. They don't actually believe this. They just know it'll shut you down. But you get accused of tarring all trans people with the same brush, you know. But then along came what I call the central outliers, right? And these are people who they exhibit some of the worst examples of trans rights activism, and they're absolutely central figures. Amy Chunder started off in Stonewall, on their trans advisory group. Stonewall are a big LGBT organization over here who've been completely captured by gender identity ideology. Amy Chunder started on the Trans Advisory Group, was also with the Greens in the UK, where Chunder was a bit of a star. Everyone had a trans member, and Chunder was the Greens one. And it turned out that during the time when Chunder was, yes, he was going for some form of election with the Greens. He was employing his father as an election agent, and his father. He knew that his father had been charged with the torture and sexual assault of a young girl in the attic of their home, very small home they shared in Coventry, and which I believe was also the Green Party headquarters, although that might be contested. But anyway, another aspect that's, you know, surreal and horrific if true. But anyway, once the Greens found out what he was about, they very quietly showed him the door. He complained of transphobia while leaving and went straight to the Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrats, who were just as dazzled by this stuff as everyone else, welcomed him with open arms. After all, he was with Stonewall. And when he got to the Liberal Democrats, some tweets of his boyfriend, his much older boyfriend, who he'd known since he was 14 years old. Some tweets of his boyfriend turned up where he basically admits to being a paedophile and writing short stories about being a paedophile. So he's thrown out of the Lib Dems. He marries his boyfriend, whose name is Nathaniel Knight, and moves to America because his political career has just kind of had its final door. No one's ever going to take him on again after all that. But when he goes into America, he immediately latches onto Elizabeth Warren's campaign and is, you know, cheering for Elizabeth Warren until she drops out when he switches over to Biden. And then the last I heard of him was he wrote an open letter to Reddit complaining about the gender critical groups that were on Reddit, which included one gender critical group that had 63,000 people on it. All the gender critical groups in Reddit were shut down. Chunder then becomes a paid moderator for Reddit. This just happened today. So it's the most extraordinary career, you know. I mean, Chunder has done nothing right, and yet keeps coming up in these different places. And not only that, but they are absolutely central. As I say, a central outlier. Like Challoner was right at the heart of Stonewall when they were making sweeping changes to safeguarding, even in places like girl guiding in the UK, which is our version of the Scouts and so on. And now they're in Reddit and they're shutting down the conversation in Reddit by banning all these groups. So for someone who came from a house that's, a little bit only slightly less horrifying than Fred West's house or Nielsen's house or any psychopath in the past who England is used to, these kind of terraced house murderers that sometimes pop up, she just rules the world. Challoner rules the world. Challoner can get into a place like Reddit and actually control the spread of information. So let's put it this way. The piece that we just wrote about Challoner today, where we detailed all this, that won't appear on Reddit. That will just kind of quietly go away the way all our stuff does, because they won't allow it to be shared.
And isn't Challoner a paid moderator on a group having to do with youth?
I think I could be wrong, but I think Nathaniel or Amy are something to do with the a group for I can't remember the name of it. It's Animal Crossing, LGBT Animal Crossing, I think the group is called, which is devoted to a Nintendo game that's very popular amongst, to be fair, not just children, but there'll be a lot of children on that sub, I bet. I mean, I don't know what Reddit's rules are for allowing children on their site, but I've certainly heard children talking about going on Reddit. So it's but the best thing about Nathaniel Knight is a moderator of the main Joe Biden group. Do you know what I mean? I wonder if Joe Biden knows this.
Oh, probably, because he's a complete supporter of the whole movement.
Yeah, but again, you've got to imagine that the problem is simply, like, as I just said, Challoner now has his hands on the controls of the flow of information. Reddit is a major place where people get their news.
Well, it's not just Challoner. This brings up something that happened just recently, which is Amazon. I recently learned that Amazon sells 53% of the books in the United States and more than 80% of the ebooks. And let's leave off where we're going with this for a second and just reflect for a moment on the absolutely chilling nature of having one mega corporation control more than 50% of the book distribution in an entire country. That by itself is horrifying.
Now
let's bring up that within the past.
Well, I know what you're leading on to.
Go ahead if you want to do it.
Well, you're about to lead on to the extraordinary announcement they made the other day, where they are not going to stock any books that equate transgender with dysphoria. Is that the story you were going to talk about?
Yeah.
I've never heard anything like it. That, to me, I've not often been frightened by something I heard, but that frightened me because that's really bad.
And I'll point out that they sell Mein Kampf, which, by the way, has more than 1,400 reviews, average of 4.5 stars.
Really? Right.
And they sell Stuka Pilot, which was the autobiography of Hans Rudel, who was one of the most amazing pilots in World War II and an unrepentant Nazi. And I completely agree that Amazon should distribute those books.
Yeah.
Because my response to a book that I don't like, and by the way, I've read Rudel's book, Stuka Pilot. It's actually quite good. If you like an autobiography of a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot. Anyway, my answer to books I don't like is to write better books.
Yeah.
But you can't do that when one side is not allowed to be distributed by the primary distributor of books in the entire country.
Yeah, and their position on this shows that this is an ideological movement. It's not a moral movement. It's an ideological movement. If it was a moral movement, there would be no question of banning something that tries to ease the burden of dysphoria amongst people. But because it's actually an ideological movement, they are literally going to endanger those people by trying to block information about them. You know, presumably some of the books being blocked will be books about the care of transgender people or trans people, you know? So it just blew me away. And it's kind of, I see this now as almost like sending your kid to a good school or something, you know? The trans identity is basically a power move, you know? And the problem with it is the people who would be, you know, there's going to be some people who are suffering from dysphoria, but there's also going to be a lot of people who see it as a power play, who see it as a way of, and I think those people, the kind of people who would use such a dishonest tactic, are exactly the kind of people you don't want to be empowering, you know? And Charles Clymer is a very good example. Charles Clymer, who was thrown out of feminist groups, because he was, you know, bullying people and disliked by the women who he was trying to order around, reinvents himself as a woman. And suddenly Joe Biden is writing an introduction for his book. You know, I may have said this to you before, Derek, but it's one of my favorite things to imagine in all this. But you know, in Bugs Bunny, when Bugs Bunny was being chased and he'd turn a corner and he quickly put on some makeup, and then the person who was chasing him, let's say it was Yosemite Sam, would come around the corner and he'd see this beautiful woman, and it was Bugs with a blonde wig and lipstick. And you know, he would kind of float with happiness at the sight of this beautiful woman. And not only would he fall in love with Bugs, he'd marry them. They get married. That's what society is like at the moment, with these con men who are using, you know, trans unhappiness and trans activism and trans experience to just, you know, get a little bit further in life, get a little bit higher up in the pecking order. It's really extraordinary. And, you know, it's taking such a long time for people to realize it, but you know, you can only do it one person at a time, it seems to me.
Well, part of the reason it's taking so long is because of this grooming and because of the lockdown. You know, by which I'm not meaning the illness lockdown or whatever. I'm meaning the lockdown of discourse. And you and I have done a couple interviews on this now, and the central thing has been that discourse is being perverted and closed off on these. Okay, a great example is that Mississippi and some other states have recently passed laws saying that males who identify as transgender cannot compete against girls in, say, high school sports. And the newspaper articles have been trans athletes not allowed to compete in sports. Yeah. And that's literally not true. Yeah. What's literally true is that males are still allowed to compete with males and females don't have to compete against males. And my point here is not the sports thing. My point here is the lie. And what we're talking about with all of this is a systematic set of the telling of falsehoods and the disallowal of the speaking of truth, whether it's in a joke or whether it's serious. And we haven't even talked about the Scottish hate crimes law.
Yes. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
And so where we have like 5 minutes left, and
Mm-hmm.
there's two things I want you to talk about. One of them is, you mentioned this in passing, but this is not just theoretical, because you mentioned it early on that there are children who are having their genitals cut off. There are children who are having their breasts removed, teenagers who are having their breasts removed. And I know that if somebody would have cut off my genitals when I was 16, I think when I finally learned what had been taken from me, or except I never would be furious. I mean,
Yeah.
As someone who is 60 years old and has had a life that has included orgasms and that has included a satisfying sex life. I mean, what does it matter whether it's satisfying
Good
or
for
not?
you, Derrick.
The point is that it's that is something that is a profoundly foundational thing. That is part of one of the gifts of being an animal.
Yeah.
And
they're robbing kids of a stage of their life. They're robbing kids of a stage of their life that brings them on to the next stage of their life. And they're arresting kids in this terrible state. I think there's another thing going on, which is a real fear of the world, that kids have. Kids who've grown up online, who haven't played out with friends and that type of thing. I know I sound like, Grandpa Simpson. I'm about to launch into a story, but it is true. These kids that have grown up online are very, very frightened of the world. And pornography, you can, the way I always put it is the young women are escaping from pornography by cutting off their breasts and escaping the male gaze that way. And young men seem to be escaping into pornography with a lot of supposedly trans young men. Basically, they seem to be enacting a pornified version of womanhood. So, I think pornography has done a number on society, and we're just at the very start of finding out what it's going to do to these kids. Because, and as an Australian pediatrician who worked with these kids said, when you're talking about the high rates of suicide of trans people, maybe it's because they discovered there's no gold at the end of the rainbow, and there isn't. It's a life of sterility, and I was saying to my friend Artie Morty, but Artie's a gay Canadian guy who works with the LGBT Alliance in America, and he and I was telling him that I saw a mother walking down the road with her son. And the son was using these slightly flamboyant movements as he walked, like almost regal, very obviously gay, very obviously camp, a camp gay boy. And I just thought, what a cool mom, because here's a young man who has obviously been showing feminine gestures, for probably since childhood. And no one ever said to him, oh, well, you're actually a girl. And he's just turned into this proud young gay man, So you can only hope there's more people like that mom around and people like that boy.
Well, that kind of leads to my last question, which is, given this lockdown of discourse, what do we do? And how do we turn this around? And how do we save discourse, and how do we save these young gay men and lesbian children?
Well, we've tried everything. I mean, we're trying everything, and it's so insane. I mean, you look at the LGBT Alliance in the UK. The LGBT Alliance is run by two older lesbians who fought through Section 28 and the AIDS crisis and all that sort of thing, and they're being vilified as a hate group by, excuse my language, but dickheads, left-wing dickheads who don't know they're born. And, they won't even, they get, whenever the BBC mentions them, they always say the LGBT Alliance, and then the announcer will lean close to the mic, who I must remind, a lot of people think are a hate group. Will the BBC actually talk to these women and perhaps find out their opinions on things, find out whether they are or are not a hate group? No, they won't even, they will never let them near a studio. So, we're getting into a situation where it's getting harder and harder to make our voices heard. And if things keep going on the way they're going, I don't know, people are going to start, I know a lot of women are now properly protesting, with banners and stickers and things left in books and things left in parks. And I think you're going to see those kind of suffragette tactics, make a reappearance, because they're not really, it's very, very difficult to get any traction in the online world, because the online world, people like the challengers at Reddit, they grease the pole for gender critical people. So you just can't get anywhere. So people are going to have to find other ways of getting attention. I mean, I'll give you the best example was at Pride, when a bunch of lesbians, lay down at the start of Pride and protested it. Extraordinarily brave thing to do, to go against that whole corporatized version of Pride and to stop it and slow it down and to be an inconvenience. In these days, that's brave. And, they told me, I spoke to the French girl who kind of who led it, and she said, we didn't want to do that. We don't want to disrupt Pride, but it was the only way we could get heard. So I think if people don't start behaving like adults and start allowing these conversations to happen, you're gonna see more moments like that, I think.
Well, thank you for all that. I guess I want to say one more thing and then have you have a response to it, and then we'll go. That is, I think as well as the things that you're talking about, which I think are absolutely crucial, I think another thing it will take is real journalism, and which you're doing, and I think that right now journalists have a lot to answer for in terms of what it's going to take is courage among journalists who will tell the truth even if it costs them their job.
Yeah. I mean, they can't fire us all. People have to start stepping up soon. Malcolm Gladwell has a theory about riots, or I think he compares it to school shootings. This is the evil version, which is where there's a school shooting and then there's another school shooting and then there's three more school shootings. It's because in the same way that during riots, someone throws it's very hard to throw the first brick, but it's easier to throw the second and the third and the fourth. And in the same way, like in that wonderful essay that you wrote, Derrick, we need people to see other people being brave and stepping up, and they need to step in, because they're still leaving me, for instance, hanging out there. I am so busy, Derrick. Every day, about 10 stories I have to cover because no one else is covering this. It's all on me. I don't want to sound arrogant, because obviously there's lots of brilliant blogs out there that are doing it and doing it better than me. But because I feel very driven and very upset by this whole movement and very nervous and worried for the children and women being affected by it, I feel guilty when I don't work on it. But I would feel less guilty if someone else was doing it. But there's so few covering it,
Well, and let's end by giving a brief prop to J.K. Rowling for the courage for her to have stood up to this, because she may have been a watershed moment in terms of resistance.
I hope so. I think she woke a lot of people up, but I think it might have come at great cost. Like she has been quiet for quite a while, and I often wonder how did they get her? How did they shut her down? I'm not saying they've silenced her. She might just be working on a book. But I know from experience that when you get into this, they scale the harassment to suit you. And she had, GLAAD trying to have private meetings with her. She got thrown off. Her name's being removed from school libraries, all this sort of shit. So I hope she's okay. That's all.
Yeah.
It's tough, whatever level you're at.
Well, thank you so much for your work in the world, and thank you for being in the program. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Graham Linehan. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. Oh, you were great again. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.